Section 1 is going to cover limits, alternatives, and choices, but before we start that section, or that part of the section, we're going to be going over graphs and their meanings. Mostly to make sure that you still remember how to interpret graphs. Dependent and independent variables. Independent variables are the cause or source, the variable that changes first. Dependent variables, the effect or outcome, is the variable that changes from the change in the independent variable. All of you should remember this from the scientific method you bet you learned back in elementary and middle school in your science classes. Usually we pick the dependent variable, the thing that we want to measure, what type of change we want to see in something. And then the independent variables are the things that we actually have control over. And then we manipulate those to try and figure out the relationship between the independent and dependent variables. Construction of a graph. Graph is just a visual representation of the relationship between two variables. A horizontal axis usually represents the independent variable, whereas the vertical axis represents the dependent variable. If the graph is a straight line, we say the relationship is linear. You can see that in our graph down here. This line right here is a linear line. So this relationship between income and consumption is a linear relationship. In this graph, it's showing a direct or positive relationship. So as income is increasing, we also see an increase in consumption. So if C increases, we also know that income will increase. Or in this graph, it's represented with a Y. So as C increases, we also have this increase in Y. An inverse or negative relationship means that the variables change in opposite directions. So here we have ticket price and the attendance in thousands. So if something changes in opposite directions, if price decreases, then we should see an increase in quantity. Notice that these two are opposites. And again, this is a linear relationship because it is a straight line. So as ticket prices decrease, we see attendance increasing. Right? Whereas 0 here, this is when both price equals 0 and quantity equals 0. So the further you get away from 0, the higher the number is. So the more you come towards 0, the lower the number gets. Other things equal, this is a very important statement. You're going to hear this a lot during this course. When we say ceteris paribus, which is just Latin for other things equal, assumption, we are saying that we are holding everything else constant. So if we're only looking at the relationship between two variables, any other type of variable that could affect that relationship is assumed constant. That means we assume any effects away. Slope of a straight line or a linear relationship. Remember, it's just rise over run. So your slope is just equal to the vertical change over the horizontal change. Infinite and zero slopes. If you have a slope that's infinite, you just have a line that's straight up and down. Or if we have a slope equal to 0, then it's just flat. If you see either of these lines, then that means the relationship between the two variables, the variable on the horizontal axis or the variable on the vertical axis, they're unrelated. Which means if one changes, it does not affect the other. They do not have any relationship together at all. Our vertical intercept is the point at where a line meets the vertical axis. So here, at this point right here would be our vertical intercept. This, as we can see, has no vertical intercept because it has an infinite slope. It's just straight up and down. For our equation of a linear relationship, we just look at y equals a plus bx, where y is our dependent variable, a is our vertical intercept, b is the slope of the line, and then x is our independent variable. So we're changing x and then looking at how it affects y. If the axes are switched so that the independent variable is on the vertical axis, so if instead we have something where it looks like this, so our dependent variable is on the horizontal axis, then the equation for a line like this would be x equals a minus by. Slope for a nonlinear curve. For a slope of a straight line, it's the same at all points. So any point along this line, the slope would be the same. But when we're representing a nonlinear relationship, the slope changes from one point to another. So in this graph here, we can see that this line is not linear. So if we were to take a slope at any point along this curve, then we get these lines that are tangent to our nonlinear curve. And a line that's tangent is not intersecting that curve. It's just finding the slope of the point along that curve. But for most of the examples in this course, we're only going to be dealing with linear relationships to make it much easier to understand. Economic pitfalls to avoid in applying the economic perspective. These things are very important for you to keep in mind whenever you're discussing any points or objectives for economics. Biases. Cloud thinking and interfere with objective analysis. If you have the idea that there's too much government or government's always less efficient than the market, we're going to have to push that aside and look at specific relationships. For example, if you want to look more into where is government inefficient or why is government inefficient, we have to look at individual relationships and look at things that are only factual. Loaded terminology. Economic terminology used is sometimes emotionally biased or loaded. If someone says that someone else is greedy, they may just be saying that that person is taking away from someone else, when really the only reason that person could be greedy is because they're self-interested. And we're all self-interested as we're human beings and want to better ourselves. Fallacy of composition. A statement that is valid for an individual or part is not necessarily valid for the larger group or whole. If you saw me and saw that I have a beard, you could say that, oh, all professors have beards. But that would be a fallacy of composition because not all professors have beards. Post hoc fallacy. Because event A precedes event B, A is the cause of B, also known as post hoc or ergo propter hoc, if you want to get all Latin. Or after this, therefore because of this. The example I like to use for this fallacy is snowing. Just because it's cold outside before it snows does not mean that because it's cold, it's going to snow. Correlation but not causation. We cannot confuse correlation or connection between two things with causation. You can have a correlation between it being cold outside and it snowing, but because it's cold, it does not cause it to snow, right? We have to have precipitation and a bunch of other things going on for it in order for it to actually snow outside. Limits, alternatives, and choices. So economics is all about how individuals, institutions, and society make choices under conditions of scarcity. So what the heck is scarcity? Scarcity means we have limited resources and unlimited desires. This pretty much is at the core of all economics. So because we have unlimited desires, we constantly want more and more of everything that makes us happy. But we have limited resources, things that we can use to fulfill those desires. So because of this problem, we have to make choices. Right? The entire idea is, how can we use these limited resources to make us as happy as possible? And the more that we fulfill our desires, the happier we are. From this, we get this no free lunch for society. Because we have these limited resources, if we use it for one thing, that means we can no longer use it for the next best thing. That next best thing that we could have used it for is just called our opportunity costs. So to obtain one more of one thing, society forgoes the opportunity of getting the next best thing, or the next best thing that I could have used it for. So all of this technology that I'm using right now to record this lecture, the opportunity cost is me playing video games. Instead of using it to record this and then all of you can see this and hear me talk, instead I could just be using it to have fun playing video games. For example. Purposeful behavior. Human behavior reflects rational self-interest. We are all rationally self-interested. We all want to better ourselves. All of you are sitting here listening to me blabber on about economics because you want to get, hopefully, a good grade in this course so you can eventually get your degree and then make more money. Right? All of you are here getting your degree, hopefully become smarter human beings and to contribute more to the society you live in and to make a better life for yourself. But all of you are doing this here so that you can make more money and make yourself better off. Economists use a fancy word called utility. And this idea of utility is to try to measure the pleasure, happiness, or satisfaction obtained from consuming a good or service. So this service of this class that you're taking right now, the utility, if any, that you get from taking this class, hopefully you become satisfied with this lecture or this course. The amount that you're satisfied would be the amount of utility you derive from Economics 201. People make decisions with some desired outcome, or this certain amount of utility at which they want to succeed or achieve. And your self-interested behavior is just meant to maximize the amount of utility that you can, to maximize your happiness. So what type of analysis can we use to maximize our utility? Economists look at marginal analysis. This analysis is looking at whenever you say the word marginal, another word for marginal is just change. So the easiest way to think about it is every time you see this word, associate it with change. So try to ease a little bit in there. All right, I just have it right over here. So the decision to obtain a marginal benefit is always going to be associated with a marginal cost. Because you have to forego something else. Remember, we always have opportunity costs because you always have limited resources. Theories, principles, and models. Economics relies on the scientific method. Remember that economics is a science, so we're going to use a scientific method. First, we observe the real-world behavior to try to come up with an idea or theory of why something's happening. Once we come up with our idea of why it's going on, we call it our hypothesis. Then we test it, and then whether or not the result we accept, reject, or modify that hypothesis based on what we find. And then we just continue testing this new hypothesis until we come up with what we think is the actual truth of what's going on. Generalizations, economic principles relating to the economic behavior, to the economy itself. Usually, like average consumers, workers, business firms. We generalize things so that it's easier for us to talk about it, to come up with an idea about it. The other thing's equal assumption. Remember, we talked about this a little bit earlier. So all variables except those under immediate consideration, the variables at which we're trying to measure that type of relationship, everything else is going to be held constant so that we can just focus straight on the relationship between those two variables. And then the graphical expression, that's just taking that relationship and then making it into a graph so it's easier for us to see and understand. Macroeconomics, that's what this course is. We're examining the kind of economy as a whole, or basic subdivisions or aggregates. Aggregates more as the whole of things. We're looking at the collection of specific units as if there were one unit. Microeconomics is more of the individual level, so the person or household or firm or industry, right? Microeconomics is looking at an individual unit, whereas macroeconomics looks at a combination of those individual units. Positive and normative economics. Positive economics is focusing on the facts and the cause and effect relationships. This is what we want to study. We want to study positive statements, positive economics, things that's actually scientific. Normative economics are those with value judgments. A lot of times normative economics come into play with the problems of the loaded terminology, biases, and all those fallacies that we talked about earlier. Society's economizing problem are our scarce economic resources. Now we're going to go into more detail about what limited resources we're actually referring to. We have 4 resource categories. The first one is land. So all natural resources, think about it as gifts of nature, Mother Nature, trees, sand, oil, water. All of these things are considered land or land resources. Next is our labor resources. Right now, I am a labor resource for the college. They use me as a professor. I'm physical and mental talents of individuals used to produce goods and services. This service is the classroom. Whenever you go to work, you're a labor resource. Next is capital. I'm using capital resources to create this video for all of you. So manufactured aids used in producing consumer goods and services. And whenever we talk about capital goods, economists refer to it as investment. So when you hear the term investment in the economist sense, we're thinking about capital goods. And the last resource category is entrepreneurial ability. Now, entrepreneurial ability is important because it combines those resources of land, labor, and capital. It takes all of those and puts them together into an efficient process to produce that good or service. They're the innovators, and then they also bear the risk. So if they succeed, they'll also bear the profits. Another term for the land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial ability is just called factors of production or inputs. So if you ever hear me referring to them or referring to factors of production or inputs, I'm referring to our 4 categories of resources. All right, our production possibilities model. This model is looking at what possible outputs we can have depending on the allocation that we use for our types of limited resources. We have 4 different assumptions starting off. We said there's full employment. Now notice that this is employing all available resources. So we employ all land, all labor, all capital, and all entrepreneurial ability. Note that this is different than full employment, such as and what you hear in the news, say the employment rate. If you hear it in the news, that's specifically talking about labor. The employment rate is usually referring to the amount of people that are currently seeking work and have work. Fixed resources. So remember, we fix this, sort of the idea of other things equal or other things constant. These resources are not changing. fixed technology. So technology is not changing. That's going to keep constant the efficiency of our production, or how productive our resources are. And then we're also going to break it down to only two goods, so that we can measure just that relationship between consumer and capital goods. This table down here, this is sort of type of the schedule between the two. So we have our production alternatives. We have 5 different alternatives. And notice that we have our 2 types of products that can be produced. We have pizzas and robots. Pizzas being our consumer good, and then robots being our capital good. So if we produce 0 pizzas, then we can make 10 robots. But if we want to increase the amount of pizzas we make by 1, notice that we have to decrease the amount of robots we're making. So pizzas goes up, but robots goes down. Notice this time, if we want to increase 1 more pizza, we have to decrease the amount of robots, but instead we have to decrease it by 2. So we lost 2 robots by gaining 1 pizza. Then when we move to D, we gain 1 more pizza, but now we're losing 3 robots. See here, 7 minus 4 gives us 3. And then our last alternative, we increase it so that we're now producing 4 pizzas, but 0 robots. Again, you should obviously see the opportunity costs going on, so that we're gaining 1 pizza and losing robots. So now we see, once my computer can load it and handle it, maybe. All right, now we see the production possibilities curve. This line right here is just graphing everything that all the numbers that we just talked about. So you can see here at point A, we're producing 10 robots and 0 pizzas. Whereas when we move to B, we're now producing 9 robots and 1 pizza. And notice how as we go more to the right, this curve gets steeper and steeper. It comes down faster and faster. That's showing the law of increasing opportunity cost. We can kind of see down here. We'll have to scroll down a little bit in a minute. But so as the particular production of pizzas increases, this industrial robots first decreases by 1, then decreases by 2, then decreases by 3, and then eventually decreases by entire 4. Notice that the amount of which it decreases at an increasing rate. I know that must sound a little confusing sometimes. So first, we decrease by 1 unit, then we decrease by 2 units, then we decrease by 3, and then we decrease by 4. So the amount at which we decrease is a bigger number for each additional pizza that we increase by. Optimal allocation. Economic decisions center on comparisons of marginal benefits. Remember, that's the change. So whenever you hear the term marginal, remember that, just think of change. Sorry if my hand's a little chicken scratch. So the benefits that you get whenever something changes is going to be the marginal benefit. And then the marginal cost is just going to be the cost of anything when you change. So economic activity should always be expanded as long as the marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost, and then should be reduced if marginal cost exceeds marginal benefit. There's this magical rule that is all important in all of economics. I dare say that this is the most important rule when you're thinking about economics. If you ever want to find the optimal quantity of something that's going to be produced and the optimal price are found by looking at where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And whenever two lines intersect one another is when they equal one another. So you can see here marginal benefit is this blue line, and here marginal cost is this increasing red line. So you find where they intersect, come down, and you get your optimal quantity, and then come over to the left, and we get our optimal price. Say price here is what you'll find for the rest of the course, and then here is just measured as your marginal benefit and our marginal cost. Alright, unemployment growth in the future. Unemployment is when people are currently seeking work. So if we were looking at specifically the labor production possibilities frontier, then this blue line is the maximum amount that can be produced. And if we have unemployment, we'd be at this point here, U. We'd be on the inside of that curve. All of this gray area out here is unattainable. So if I had a point here, say W, this cannot happen in our current situation. This is unattainable when we have our production possibilities frontier along this line. Economic growth occurs when we have a larger total output. And so if we have economic growth, what we're going to see is an increase in the production possibilities curve. We're going to see it shifting outward and to the right. In this graph right here, it shows economic growth by watching the curve go from the inside and then growing all the way out here to the right to this much bigger curve. Notice that this yellowish area is also now included. So if previously our W is here, and it was previously unattainable, now that once we have this jump in our curve, we can now produce W. But notice that we would not want to produce at this point because that would be at unemployment. We want to produce along this line because when you produce along the PPC curve, then you are maximizing your possible production. Economic growth can happen from either an increase in supplies of resources, say that you struck a new oil field or you gain new property, improvements in resource quality, say that all of your labor goes to school and then they become more productive, or we can have technological advances. Technological advances such as the equipment that I'm using, say it advances so that now it's possible for me to create this video for all of you, whereas before this technology you couldn't even have an online class. Your present choices do have an impact on future possibilities. In these graphs here, we have goods for the present on the horizontal axis, and then goods for the future on the vertical axis. So here, we show that in the current curve, we produce more current goods than we do goods for the present. And because of that, the jump in our future curve is rather small. Whereas if we choose to produce a majority of future goods in the present in our current curve, and then a small amount of goods for the present, our growth is going to be much larger. Notice how this growth is much larger than the growth when a society focuses mainly on goods for the present. And specialization and trade have the same effect as having more and better resources. So if we can start having specialization and trading, then we can also have an increase in our production possibilities curve. Alright, that concludes section 1. So now you can go ahead, I suggest doing some more studying, maybe practicing a few problems, and then you're ready to take the quiz. Good luck.